So thank you very much for this possibility. And actually, this paper is part of my book project, and part of the presentation will speak about my book project as well, which is devoted to the historical exploration of the northwestern Russian borders, and not only northwestern, but so my main idea is that the uniqueness of the Russian borders in the 20th and 21st centuries was that they formed a part of a highly ideological and highly contested project, first of communism and then of the so-called Russian World Project, which positioned itself as distinct, but in fact had very much in common with the previous one. And the perception of the project as highly contested from the outside as well as from the inside resulted in the fact that the borders and border controls function not in the traditional functional sense of controlling and alleviating the transborder flows of people and commodities, but as tools of the existential struggle for the regime survival. And recently, the so-called hybrid operations, which have been a reality in fact, from the beginning of the 20th century, yet again came to the fore of the Russian border policy. In the history of borders, the Soviet case and then the Russian one was post-Soviet one, was unique, not so much because of its lock and key ideal, but because of its transformative agenda, and that's what I'm studying here. There were other factors of its uniqueness. For example, a combination of ethnophilia and paranoia in regards to non-Russian population, migrants and ethnic minorities in the borderland, how Terry Martin had put it, resulted in peculiar human resources management in border areas and for state defense protection. The Soviet and post-Soviet attitude towards trans-border illegal flows such as smuggling, illegal migration made a radical break from the Russian Empire, where the authorities were mainly concerned about the spread of subversive ideas, like when illegal movements and revolutionary groups challenged imperial authorities and used trans-border flows for that purpose, but they were not using it themselves. And the Soviet and then post-Soviet states actively manipulated these informal networks to expand their political influence, exert pressure in contested borderlands, or to subvert the neighboring states. And here the historiography, like the historiography of major historical trends in which I was trying to look for inspiration for my project. And now we are going to the sources which I'm using while trying to compare two cases. One case of the 1920s and then another case of like 100 years later. And here are some things from the later period. I was analyzing how the Russian state was how the official policy of the Russian state towards the migrants coincided with the illicit uses of the migrants' flows in and out of the country. And here are some statistics which I found, and I'll also how the trends of the migrant Russian state's attitude towards migrants influenced the current situation. And now I'm going to my two cases. The first one was the transborder hybrid operations of the Soviet political police in the 1920s. I look how they used this first migration crisis and how they transformed the social identities of those whom they involved. They were like the borderlanders tried to use the border for their own means for the economic survival, and the Russians and the Soviet state was using them for their own political purposes, and the processes of social transformation occurred. There were various networks forms. The Czechies were transforming into smugglers, the peasants were transforming into Czechies, and the customs officials were transforming into criminals. And all this happened in the peculiar context. And the second case is the hybrid warfare cases of the 1920s. There were three cases. And I'm also using how I'm looking at how the interpretations in mass media and historiography of this of this instance is changed with time. While initially, after the first migration crisis at the Russian northwestern border in 2015, 2016, there were many works that insisted that the Russian state did not interfere directly, and it was like factors like the Russian bureaucratic ineptitude or apathy, incompetence of the border guards that contributed to this crisis when thousands of the refugees from different countries streamed through Russian northwestern borders to seek a political asylum in Norway and Finland. And later, with two other incidents of the Arctic route, in the Belarusian case and the later Russian case, when yet again the temperatures in 2022 went back minus 22 degrees zero. Again, thousands of smugglers in bicycles went through the border to seek asylum. But within the changing geopolitical context of the Russian war in Ukraine, the interpretations radically changed, and everyone claimed that this was the actually hybrid warfare on the part of the Russian state directed at Norway and Finland for various reasons for accession to NATO and so on. And yet again, I'm looking at the socially transforming nature that, for example, how the accounts interpret how the Russian state manipulated the second occurrence, that it was through global social networks actually offering the migrants and the intermediaries the new possibilities of going to the EU to seek a political asylum, and I'm using the social accounts to trace the transformatory effects of these double standards. And the double standards is that on the one hand, the Russian state ostensibly actually wages the warfare on the migrants, even looking at them as disrupting the Russian state, disrupting its functioning, but on the other hand, it's actively using them in illicit transborder operations. And going to my conclusion, I would say that the controlled migration as a geopolitical tool was not only present, but central to Soviet domestic and foreign policy, and in a different form also in contemporary Russia. Despite alarmist claims about recent changes in the Russian way of waging war and exploiting its borders, including the so-called Gerasimov doctrine, all current practices seem to be a mirror image of all Soviet approaches, and we need to shift the time frame because the majority of scholars who claim that the current Russian operations are a new wine in an old bottle. They never go beyond. They almost never go beyond the Cold War period. And in the 1920s, we can find a lot of inspiration. For example, as Vladimir Lenin stated in August 1920, we should take military measures try to punish Latvia and Iceland immediately. For example, on the shoulders of Balakovich, it's an sergeant, to cross the border and hang around 100 of their bureaucrats and riches. And so I also wanted to say that, yet again, I'll repeat that the peculiarity of Russian transborder uses of migrations and history arise from its peculiar transformative impacts. And the direct part consisted of the Soviet and Russian ideological agenda of turning the borderland residents as well as migrants into the politically loyal, homogenized social mass, but the indirect part of the border project actively recruited clandestine accomplices from the ranks of smugglers, state servants, border controllers, entrepreneurs, migrants, and refugees for destabilizing the neighboring countries. And the consequences of social transformations caused by transborder impacts usually transpired during the periods of political turbulence and international instability. and manifested themselves in the form of deep long-term shadow alliances, corruption license, and interagency hostilities. And that's what I'm also studying, the interagency hostilities between the Soviet Chekists, Russian political security services, and the customs apparatus, and between the smugglers, entrepreneurs. They all made the Russian border encounters unique. In words of Rudyard Kipling, describing a frontal encounter between the son of a colonel and the border thief. But there is neither east or west, border nor breed, nor birth, when two strong men stand face to face, though they come from the ends of the earth. And for me, this citation is very important because it's like it portrays this border space, which becomes an array of long-term unintended consequences. The Russian border converted the smugglers into the counterintelligence agents and vice versa. And everything is absolutely unpredictable, but we should go further into that. Thank you very much.